Okay, and welcome to Investigation 16. This is 16C, the Industrial Revolution Primary Document Analysis. And what we're going to do here is what we always do with a 16C, Primary Document Analysis. We're going to use the primary documents, we're going to use the analysis grid and the teacher model video I'm currently creating to categorize evidence and to corroborate the historical evidence in preparation for an argumentative essay. All right, let's take a look. All right, this is our Industrial Revolution Primary Analysis, Document 1. Okay, let's take a look. The following is an excerpt from William Cooper's testimony before the Sadler Committee in 1832. When you see the vocabulary term testimony, this is a court-based interview, either before the court process or an interview during on the stand. Now, if we look at the bottom of the document, it says the Sadler Committee is a committee to investigate the working conditions in English textile factories. Okay, so they want to know what is going on inside the factory. So they're going to interview a factory worker. So let's read it. So Sadler asks, "What is your age?" And William Cooper says, "I am 8 and 20. So if you reverse it, he's 28 years old. Sadler says, "When did you first begin to work in the mills?" And Cooper says, "When I was 10 years of age." 10-year-old boy. Sadler says, "What were your usual hours of working?" And Cooper says, "We began at 5 in the morning and we stopped at 9 in the night." Wow, that is a long work day. Sadler asks, "What time did you have for meals?" And Cooper says, "We had just one period of 40 minutes in the 16 hours. Wow, and that was at noon. Sadler asks, "What means were taken to keep you awake and attentive?" And Cooper says, "At times we were frequently strapped." That means hit or beat with a strap or a belt. Sadler asks, "When your hours were so long, did you have any time to attend a day school?" And Cooper said, "We had no time to go to day school." So Sadler asks, "Can you read and write?" And Cooper replies, "I can read, but I cannot write." So here we have some primary evidence through the eyes of a person who experienced the conditions of the factory system in England, in a textile factory in 1832. This is a window into the past, primary source. So let's take a look at the bottom. What is it? Well, this is an excerpt from William Cooper's testimony before the Sadler Committee. Okay, and who said it? Well, William Cooper. He's a factory worker who worked in the factory when he was 10 years old. Okay, what is the purpose? Why is he saying this? He wants to inform the reader or anyone of the challenges of working in an English textile factory. And you can see here the long hours, the short lunch break. They were beat and they didn't have enough time to go to school. Is there any bias? Is this individual favoring someone or a group of people? Well, what we would have to do is match this document up with other documents to see if they corroborate or match. And if they do, the more documents match, the more credibility that this person's words have. So we already performed image analysis. We looked at photos of primary experiences of factory workers. We looked at secondary analysis from historians, and now we're looking at the words of people who were there. So does the words of this individual match up with the primary images and the secondary historical research? It does. So it's not really biased. This is to inform us of the truth. What is the message? Well, factory workers suffered harsh working conditions in English textile factories, which hinders their ability for social mobility. And what we mean by that is, Sadler asks, "Can you read and write?" And Cooper says, "I can read, but I cannot write." Those are the long-term effects over time of the working conditions in which there was not enough time to gain an education. Therefore, this person is not educated enough to move up the social ladder. They are not qualified to get a higher paying job. They're stuck in the situation they are in. Okay? Now, what is a quote that supports that? We took two parts of the interview. At times, we were frequently strapped, and that reflects the conditions in which they were beat inside the factory. And over time, he says, "I can read, but I cannot write. And that reflects the negative effects over time of the factory system conditions in which this person did not gain an education, in which they cannot gain a higher paying job and move up the social ladder. They were stuck in their situation. Okay? If you need to pause the video, you can pause it now to go over the information. Let's move on to document 2. What is document 2? Okay, this is an excerpt, another snippet, okay? A piece of a book or a manual. It's from The Philosophy of Manufacturers, written by Andrew in 1835. Now, what is a philosophy of manufacturers? What is a philosophy? A philosophy is a way of thinking, a way of being, a way of living and conducting yourself in the world that we live in. So this is a way of running your business for business owners, almost a manual, right, in which you should follow if you're a business owner. And let's see what Andrew says. He says, I have visited many factories, both in Manchester and in the surrounding districts, and I have never saw a single instance of corporal chastisement, in other words, beating, inflicted on a child. They seem to be always cheerful and alert, in the factories, taking pleasure in the light play of their muscles as they worked hard. They were cheerful and alert in the factories. As to exhaustion, they showed no trace of it. They were never tired of a 16-hour workday, he says. On the emerging from the mill in the evening, for they began to skip about. After their 16-hour workday, they skipped home. It is moreover my firm conviction, or his opinion, that children would thrive better when employed in our factories, modern factories, than if left at home in apartments, often too ill-aired, damp, and cold. All right. Does this eyewitness account of what's going on in the factories match up with the primary images you saw, the historical evidence, the secondary evidence written by professors and historians, and the words of the individual's experience as a factory worker in the factory in document 1? Obviously, no. It contradicts all of that body of evidence. So why would this factory owner write a manual that says it's beneficial for children to work long hours in factories? We need to figure this out. So what is this? This is an excerpt from The Philosophy of Manufacturers by Andrew And who said it? Well, Andrew in 1835. This is his position. His purpose, and this is his purpose here. Why would he try to persuade anybody who reads this book that it's beneficial to hire children to work in the factories? Well, look, this is The Philosophy of Manufacturers. So who would read this book? Manufacturers, in other words, owners of the factories. So he wants to convince them that it's more beneficial to hire children than it is to hire adults. And if you remember from your previous investigation, children were paid less. Therefore, factory owners made more. So what is his true purpose here? Andrew wants to persuade factory owners of the benefits of child labor. And that's for owners, right? So is there bias? Is Andrew the factory owner who wrote this book for factory owners, is he trying to inform factory owners of the true experience of the factory worker? Or is he trying to persuade them to believe a version of the truth that's beneficial for the factory owner? You guessed it. Is favoring the factory owner's perspective. Hire children, they work for less, therefore you make more money, you become more wealthy and powerful. So I'm going to paint a picture from my experience of walking through my own factory that's favorable toward factory owners. So what's the message here? The factory owner shapes their perspective of the worker's experience to benefit the factory owner. People, young historians, this is why we need to dig through a body of evidence to uncover the truth, This is a version of the truth. But when you compare it to the photographic evidence that we have, the body of photographic evidence, multiple photos of multiple children in multiple factories all over America and Europe, you can see that this is not the most accurate version of the truth. And when you compare it to historical secondary evidence of professors who've done their research, you can see this does not corroborate. It does not match with what is closest to the true experience of the factory worker, of the child. Therefore, you can say this person is bending a version of the truth to benefit either himself and or the group of people he's related to, the factory owners. Okay? What is the quote that supports the message? And this is where Andrew Err says, "It is moreover my firm conviction, my opinion, what I believe from walking through the factory, that children would thrive better when employed in our modern factories than if left at home in apartments, too often ill-aired, damp, and cold." So he paints the negative picture of being at home alone in the apartment is more detrimental and more negative consequences than actually for a child to work 16 hours a day in a factory. Okay? So if you need to pause the video now, you pause the video and take down the information you need for document 2. Let's move on to document 3. Now we're digging deep. Let's dig deep and try to uncover a version of the truth. Let's corroborate, let's categorize, and let's see how accurate this information is. This excerpt, it's another excerpt, a piece of a book. The excerpt from The Conditions of the Working Class in England. It was written by Frederick Engels after he visited an English industrial city in 1844. We need a little background on Frederick Engels. Let's look at the bottom of the document. Frederick Engels was an opponent of Western capitalism and the factory system conditions. Okay, so he was against the system of business in America and Europe that favored the business owner much more than the factory worker. And he wants to prove that with his first-person observations of walking around factories in England and walking around cities in England to see the consequences of the Industrial Revolution on those workers in the factories and on the sanitary conditions of the city. So let's see. Frederick Engels says this: "Every great town has one or more slum areas where workers struggle through life as best they can, out of sight of the more fortunate class of society." In other words, the upper class pays for people to clean their designated area of the city, and the working class are too poor and don't have enough money. So it looks very different than the rich, fortunate classes of society. The slums are generally unplanned wilderness of 1 or 2-storied houses. Remember the tenement buildings. Wherever possible, these have cellars which are also used as dwellings. People lived in the basements. The streets are usually unpaved, full of holes, filthy and strewn with refuse, garbage. Since they have neither gutters nor drains, the refuse accumulates and builds in stagnant, stinking puddles. The view of Manchester, this is a city in England, is quite typical. The main river is narrow, coal-black, polluted, and full of stinking filth and rubbish, garbage, which deposits on its banks, on the sides of the river and in the river. One walks along a very rough path on the riverbank to reach a chaotic group of little 1-story, 1-room cabins. In front of the doors, filth and garbage abound. In other words, everywhere. Okay, so let's take a look at our analysis. What is this? This is an excerpt from The Conditions of the Working Class in England, a piece of a book. Who said it? Frederick Engels. Why did Frederick Engels say this? Does he want to inform us of what he saw? Does he want to persuade us a version of what he saw? Or does he want to entertain us with his words? And we can say that he wants to inform the reader of the unsanitary living conditions in Manchester, England, because he was there, he walked the streets, and he informed us of what he saw. Okay, is there bias? Is he trying to favor somebody? Well, we can say that although he is an opponent of Western capitalism and the way that Americans and Europeans did business with the factory system, where the owner was heavily favored over the workers, and he wasn't happy with the working conditions of the factory workers. He walked the city in this case, and we can take what he says for fact as he's providing us with his first-person observation of the unsanitary conditions and the dirt and the filth in the poor section of Manchester, England. Okay? What is his message? The challenges of the factory system, right? The pollution produced. It caused unsanitary conditions in cities for the working class. And what is the quote that supports this message? And he says, the slums are generally unplanned wilderness of 1 or 2 storied houses. The streets are usually unpaved, full of holes, filthy, and strewn with refuse. So once again, when we look at this body of first-person observations from somebody who was there, and knowing Frederick Engels was against Western capitalism, he was against the American and European system of business, we can say there's a chance that he is favoring a system that would favor the factory workers against this American and European system. Therefore, he may bend the truth. If we compare his first-person observation to the first-person observation of many other individuals in and around Manchester, plus the photographs that we have of people who were there in and around Manchester, and we also compare all of that evidence to the historians who used secondary evidence and primary evidence to fill our textbooks with the descriptions of the cities in and around Manchester during this time, we can conclude it all corroborates and matches. Therefore, the validity of what he's saying is high. He's credible in this case. He's not bending the truth. He's not lying, because the evidence matches in this particular case. Okay? So, you're going to move on, and you're going to look at document 4, and you're going to perform the analysis on your own in the same way we just have, which is an excerpt from The Working Man's Companion, subtitled The Results of Machinery, namely cheap production and increased employment. And it was published in 1831. You can take a look at that one. And you're going to look at document 5. Here's an excerpt from another piece of testimony from Joseph Hebergram to the Sadler Committee. Once again, you're going to see if this individual's experience working in the factory doesn't match up with document 1, William Cooper's testimony. Finally, well, you're going to look at document 6, a description from a pamphlet that's published in 1797 from the Society of Bettering the Condition and Increasing the Comforts of the Poor. You can kind of infer the perspective here. And finally, document 7, from John Burley, who was born in London in 1805. He lost his parents at the age of 5. He was sent to a green workhouse, and he began working at the Cessbrook factory. He was interviewed about his experience as a child worker in 1849, and an article on his life was published in the newspaper called the Ashton Chronicle in May of 1849. And you're going to read an excerpt of his experience, and you can compare it to the rest. I hope this helps.